Civilization likes to imagine itself as a straight line, a steady climb from fire to fiber optics. But the ground beneath that story is fractured. Beneath oceans, under deserts, inside myths, dismissed as metaphor, there are hints of something more unsettling, that progress is not permanent, and that humanity may have risen, collapsed, and risen again more than once. Stone structures that seem too precise, legends that repeat across continents, genetic scars that point to near extinction. None of these fit comfortably into a clean timeline. They suggest interruption, erasure, and rebuilding. If the knowledge can be lost faster than it is gained, then history is not a ladder, but a cycle shaped by catastrophe. And if that is true, the past is not dead, it is warning us. Before we dive deeper, ignite that like button and prepare for the revelations to come. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from, what time it is there. And as always, with our videos, the visuals are here to add context, but they aren't necessary to follow along. Thank you for always having our back. Prepare yourself and let's dive in. The planet does not remember us kindly. It erases, wind grinds cities into dust, water drags coastlines into the sea, heat twists metal until it flakes into rust. On geological time, even mountains are temporary gestures. This matters because when people imagine lost civilizations, they imagine ruins standing patiently waiting to be found. Reality is harsher. The Earth recycles its surface like a slow, relentless machine, turning evidence into sediment, sediment into stone, stone back into melt. If a complex society once existed far earlier than our written memory, its absence would not be mysterious at all. It would be expected. Earth is about 4.5 billion years old. Modern humans have been here roughly 300,000 years. Written history covers barely the last 5,000. That means more than 98% of human existence sits outside recorded memory, a vast stretch where stories thin out and assumptions rush in to fill the silence. The default assumption has long been simplicity, small bands, stone tools, endless repetition. But assumptions are not evidence. Archaeology, genetics, and geology now paint a far less tidy picture. Consider what time alone does to materials. Steel, the backbone of modern cities, begins to oxidize the moment it is exposed. Within centuries it weakens. Within millennia it crumbles into mineral traces indistinguishable from natural iron deposits. Concrete cracks as water seeps in, freezes, expands, and breaks it apart grain by grain. Glass, which seems eternal, slowly reorganizes its molecular structure, turning cloudy, brittle, and eventually fragmenting. Plastics survive longer but not intact, breaking down under ultraviolet light into microscopic particles that scatter into soil and oceans. None of these leave clean signatures after deep time. Stone does, but only certain kinds and only under certain conditions. Leave a modern city unattended. In a decade, plants invade cracks. In a century, roofs collapse. In 1,000 years, walls fall. Foundations are pried apart by roots and frost. Streets vanish beneath soil. After 10,000 years, only fragments remain, scattered, buried, unrecognizable. After 100,000, even those fragments are likely gone. Multiply that by tectonic motion. Oceanic crust is recycled every 200 million years, dragged back into the mantle at subduction zones. Continental crust lasts longer, but it too is folded, fractured, eroded, and buried. A city built 100 million years ago would not be hiding. It would be gone. This erasure is not theoretical. We see it in real time through Earth's cycles. Continents drift, collide, and tear apart. Entire oceans open and close. The Himalayas rose as India crashed into Eurasia, climbing millimeter by millimeter each year, while rivers simultaneously stripped billions of tons of rock away. Without constant uplift, those peaks would flatten into plains. Now stretch that process over tens of millions of years. Anything built on the surface becomes temporary decoration. This is why the question of ancient, advanced civilizations is often misunderstood. It is not about missing skyscrapers or intact machines. It is about anomalies, signals that do not belong. Geology is a layered archive. Each layer is a page written by climate, chemistry, and catastrophe. Most pages are repetitive, some are not. Mass extinctions leave unmistakable marks, sudden shifts in isotope ratios, spikes in iridium from asteroid impacts, abrupt changes in fossil assemblages. These markers persist for hundreds of millions of years. If an industrial civilization existed deep in the past, it would not leave ruins. It would leave fingerprints. In 2018, researchers proposed a thought experiment now known as the Silurian hypothesis, named after a fictional ancient species, not a claim of reptilian ancestors. The idea was simple. If an industrial civilization arose millions of years ago, what traces would remain today? The answer was not monuments, but chemistry. Fossil fuel combustion leaves a distinctive carbon isotope signature. Synthetic compounds, especially those with long molecular chains, would appear suddenly in sediments. Rare earth elements, mined and dispersed unnaturally, would show unusual concentrations. Massive agriculture would alter nitrogen cycles. Rapid warming would leave climate signals nearly indistinguishable from those we see now. What made the hypothesis uncomfortable was not speculation, but familiarity. Some ancient layers already show strange features: rapid carbon spikes, abrupt warming events, chemical anomalies whose causes are debated. Most are attributed to volcanism or natural feedback loops, and many explanations are convincing. But the point remains: the tools to detect something unnatural have only recently been considered. For most of scientific history, no one was looking. Genetics adds another layer to the story. Human DNA carries evidence of severe population bottlenecks, moments when our numbers collapsed dramatically. One such bottleneck appears around 74,000 years ago, coinciding with the Toba super-eruption. Ash spread across continents, temperatures dropped. For a time, humanity may have been reduced to just a few thousand individuals. All modern humans descend from that narrow survival funnel. Civilization, if it existed before, would not have survived intact. Knowledge requires continuity. Break the chain, and skills vanish within generations. Even without a global catastrophe, localized collapses show how fragile complexity is. Writing disappears. Engineering techniques are forgotten. Trade networks shatter. When systems fail, people revert to survival. Memory shortens. Within centuries, even remarkable achievements become myth. Within millennia, myth hardens into ritual, symbol, or story stripped of context. This is why legends matter, not as literal records, but as emotional memory. Flood stories appear across cultures separated by oceans. They describe the same pattern: a world destroyed, survivors fleeing to high ground, knowledge carried forward into a new age. It is easy to dismiss this as coincidence until geology enters the conversation. At the end of the last ice age, sea levels rose more than 100 meters. Coastlines shifted inland by hundreds of kilometers. Entire landscapes where people lived for generations vanished beneath water. For those who lived through it, the world did end. The question is not whether civilization can be erased. We know it can. The question is how many times it has happened and how much we assume about the emptiness of the past simply because our methods were not designed to see what was lost. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence when the process itself destroys evidence by design. History, as we tell it, is built on what survived. Stone tools endure, bones fossilize, temples collapse slowly, but the most powerful forces leave the least obvious traces. Fire leaves ash. Time leaves silence. If humanity rose earlier, reached heights we no longer remember, and fell back into scarcity, the earth would not preserve the story for us. It would compress it, smear it, and file it away beneath layers of forgetting. What remains is not proof, but possibility grounded in physics, chemistry, and time. Civilization is not guaranteed. Progress is not permanent. The planet does not care how advanced a society becomes. It responds only to mass, energy, and force. And those forces have reset the board again and again. If that has happened before, then our era is not the culmination of history. It is simply the current iteration. Stone does not lie easily. It breaks, erodes, collapses, but when it survives, it carries intent frozen in mass. Across the world, there are stone structures that do not fit comfortably inside the story of gradual progress from simplicity to complexity. They are not mysterious because they exist, but because of when they exist. They appear too early, too precise, too coordinated for the cultural stages they are assigned to. To explain them away, history often shrinks their implications instead of expanding its questions. In southeastern Anatolia, a low hill once dismissed as a natural rise concealed something that should not have been there. When excavation began, it revealed towering stone pillars arranged in deliberate circular patterns. These pillars were carved into T-shapes, some standing nearly 20 feet tall, weighing up to 15 tons each. Their surfaces were not crude. They carried reliefs of animals rendered with confidence, foxes mid-stride, serpents coiling, vultures with wings spread. The site was dated to roughly 11,600 years ago, a time when humanity was supposedly limited to small nomadic groups scraping by through hunting and gathering. This period sits before agriculture, before pottery, before permanent settlements as traditionally defined, and yet the structure required organization, planning, quarrying, transportation, and symbolic coordination on a massive scale. Stone had to be cut from bedrock using tools assumed to be primitive. It had to be moved kilometers uphill. It had to be positioned with care. And then, for reasons still unknown, the entire complex was deliberately buried, preserved under thousands of tons of soil, as if sealed for another age. The implications are uncomfortable. Conventional models say complex society follows farming, surplus, and hierarchy. But here, monumental construction appears first. This reverses the expected order. One possibility is that the model is wrong, that social complexity can arise before agriculture, driven by ritual, shared belief, or inherited knowledge. Another possibility is more disruptive, that these builders were not starting from zero. This is not an isolated case. In Lebanon, at Baalbek, a massive stone platform underlies later Roman temples. 3 stones in this foundation, known as the trilithon, each weigh around 800 tons. They were quarried nearby, lifted, and set with such precision that a blade cannot fit between them. Even modern cranes struggle at this scale. Explanations often invoke enormous labor forces in simple machines, but calculations strain credibility. Tens of thousands of people pulling ropes do not overcome friction and gravity so easily, especially on uneven terrain. Across the ocean in South America, polygonal stone walls defy expectation. At sites like Sacsayhuaman, massive blocks were cut into irregular shapes with dozens of angles, then fitted together so tightly that they resist earthquakes without mortar. These stones were not chosen for convenience. Some weigh over 100 tons. Their surfaces curve inward slightly, a technique that increases stability but requires extraordinary foresight. The builders had no iron tools, no wheeled transport, and no written language that we know of, yet the stones sit as if poured into place. When Spanish chroniclers asked the local inhabitants who built these structures, they were told it was not their ancestors, but people from a deeper past. Giants, gods, or unknown predecessors, depending on the retelling. Modern archaeology often dismisses such statements as myth, but myth can be memory compressed by time, stripped of technical detail, and reimagined through symbolism. Dismissing it entirely is a choice, not a necessity. On a remote island in the Pacific, colossal statues stare inland, their backs to the sea. The Moai are famous, but less attention is given to the stone platforms they stand on. These platforms use the same tight-fitting, multi-angled stonework seen thousands of miles away in the Andes. The similarity is unsettling. It suggests either independent invention of the same rare technique or a shared lineage of knowledge that traveled far earlier than accepted timelines allow. Egypt pushes this tension further. The Great Pyramid is often described as a pile of stones, but that description hides its sophistication. Its base is leveled to within a fraction of an inch across 13 acres. Its sides align almost perfectly with the cardinal directions. Internal chambers use granite beams weighing up to 80 tons, transported from quarries hundreds of miles away. Granite is harder than copper tools can easily handle, yet it was cut with precision. More puzzling than the size is the knowledge encoded. The pyramid's proportions reflect relationships between Earth's dimensions and astronomical cycles. Whether intentional or coincidental remains debated, but coincidence repeated at this scale becomes statistically thin. The builders worked as if they understood the planet they stood on, not just the stone beneath their feet. These structures force an uncomfortable realization. Human capability does not always progress in a straight line. Skills can appear, disappear, and reappear. When a society collapses, it does not just lose power, it loses memory. Techniques that require apprenticeship, tradition, and cumulative refinement vanish quickly. Within a few generations, people may no longer know how their ancestors achieved what now stands before them. This has happened within recorded history. Roman concrete, stronger in seawater than modern formulations, was lost for centuries. Greek fire vanished. Medieval artisans created stained glass recipes that could not be replicated later. These losses occurred over hundreds of years, not thousands. Scale that fragility backward, and the disappearance of advanced stoneworking traditions becomes not mysterious but inevitable. One argument often raised is that no transitional artifacts exist, no gradual improvement leading up to these feats. But that assumes continuity was preserved. If knowledge arrived from elsewhere or survived a collapse in fragments, its physical trail could be thin. Stone monuments might be the final expression of a tradition already fading, built as statements of permanence in an unstable world. Another assumption is that ancient people lacked motivation. Why would hunter-gatherers build monuments? But motivation does not require agriculture. It requires meaning, ritual, cosmology, shared identity, and fear of loss are powerful drivers. If a previous world ended in catastrophe, survivors might prioritize remembrance over comfort, monument over settlement. These stones may not be the beginning of civilization, but its echo. They may represent a handoff between eras where remnants of older knowledge were used by emerging societies that did not fully understand their origin, only their significance. Over time, the knowledge faded, leaving behind only the structures themselves, mute and resistant to explanation. Stone endures longer than stories, but not forever. What survives does so by chance and burial. If earlier cycles of civilization existed, we would not expect abundance of evidence. We would expect anomalies, outliers that do not fit, stones that feel out of place in time. And those are exactly what we find. The question is no longer whether ancient people were clever, that is beyond doubt. The deeper question is whether cleverness itself has a deeper history than we allow, one interrupted by forces that do not care how high a culture climbs. If stone is the last thing left standing after collapse, then stone is where the past would speak, quietly, stubbornly, waiting for us to notice that it does not belong where we have placed it. If stone hints at forgotten capability, technology exposes it. Not grand machines or engines, but devices so precise they feel misplaced, like objects dropped into the wrong century. These artifacts do not shout, they whisper, and what they whisper is unsettling. That technical knowledge has appeared before, matured, and then vanished, leaving behind only isolated survivors stripped of their context. In the early 20th century, sponge divers working off a Greek island recovered what looked like a corroded lump of bronze from a Roman shipwreck. At first it was dismissed as debris, only later, when it fractured, did gears spill out, not decorative gears, not symbolic ones, but precision-cut teeth arranged in complex ratios. Decades of study revealed something no one expected, a mechanical device capable of predicting celestial motions with astonishing accuracy. It tracked the cycles of the sun and moon, forecast eclipses, and modeled irregular lunar movement using offset gearing, a technique not seen again for over 1,000 years. This was not a toy. It was not an experiment. It was the product of a mature tradition of mechanical engineering. The tolerances required to cut interlocking bronze gears like these demand tools, measurement standards, and skilled specialists. Yet nothing comparable appears again until medieval astronomical clocks. The chain was broken. The knowledge did not pass forward. It disappeared. This loss is not unique. In Mesopotamia, a simple ceramic vessel was unearthed containing a copper cylinder and an iron rod sealed with asphalt. On its own, it seemed unremarkable. When reconstructed and filled with an acidic liquid, it produced a measurable electrical current, a battery nearly 2,000 years old. Whether it was used for electroplating, ritual, or something else remains debated, but its function is real. Electricity was being harnessed, however modestly, long before modern science claims its discovery. Elsewhere, optical precision appears far earlier than expected. Crystal lenses, ground and polished, capable of magnification, have been found in ancient contexts. One such lens, dated to the first millennium BCE, has optical properties comparable to a simple magnifying glass. Its existence implies understanding of light, curvature, and focal length. These are not accidental outcomes of casual craftsmanship. They are deliberate. Metallurgy offers even clearer examples. In India stands an iron pillar over 7 meters tall that has resisted corrosion for more than 16 centuries, despite exposure to monsoons and humidity. Modern analysis shows it was forged with a specific phosphorus content that forms a passive protective layer. This was not luck. It was controlled chemistry, achieved without modern instruments, and later forgotten. Medieval Europe would struggle with rust for centuries before rediscovering comparable techniques. In South America, ancient cultures worked with platinum, a metal that melts at temperatures far higher than those achievable with simple fires. The objects were not crude, they were shaped, combined with gold, and crafted with intent. European metallurgists would not master platinum until the modern era. The question is not how these ancient people did it, but why their methods vanished so completely. The pattern repeats, capability appears, flourishes briefly, then collapses into obscurity. This is not how cumulative progress behaves. In a stable system, knowledge stacks. Each generation adds to the last. When knowledge resets, it suggests interruption severe enough to break transmission. War can do this, so can famine, plague, or environmental collapse. But on a global scale, only catastrophe can erase so broadly. Technology depends on networks. Specialists rely on supply chains, apprentices, and shared standards. Remove enough nodes and the system collapses. A single generation without teachers is enough to end a craft. Written instructions help, but writing itself can be lost or rendered meaningless without context. Once gone, rediscovery may take centuries if it happens at all. What makes these ancient technologies unsettling is not that they exist, but that they appear isolated like the last surviving pages of burned libraries. They hint at broader traditions that left little trace. We assume absence means non-existence, but that assumption ignores how fragile technological ecosystems are. A stone axe can be reinvented easily. Precision gearing cannot. Even in modern times, we see how quickly knowledge decays. Entire programming languages become obsolete within decades. Specialized manufacturing techniques disappear when demand drops. Space agencies have lost the ability to reproduce certain components because the people who built them retired or died. This is happening now in a digital age with redundant storage. Imagine how much faster loss occurs without global communication. If a civilization rose before ours, its most advanced technologies would be the least likely to survive. Organic materials rot, metals corrode, complex devices break and are scavenged. What remains are anomalies, a gear where no gear should be, a battery without wires, a lens without a telescope. These objects appear miraculous only because their supporting worlds are gone. Critics often argue that these artifacts are misunderstood, that we project modern expectations onto ancient ingenuity. Sometimes this is fair. Not every odd object is revolutionary. But skepticism cuts both ways. Dismissing evidence because it does not fit a preferred narrative is not caution, it is bias. The proper response is curiosity grounded in physics and craftsmanship, not reflexive denial. Another objection is scale. If advanced technology existed, where are the factories, the mines, the waste? But this assumes industrialization must look like ours. A different technological path might prioritize precision over mass production, durability over disposability. It might rely on renewable materials, human skill, and small-scale specialization rather than fossil fuels. Such a civilization could leave far fewer scars, and scars fade. Mining pits fill, forests reclaim land, rivers bury cities in silt, even plastic, once thought eternal, fragments into invisibility. Geological time is ruthless. It does not preserve narratives, only traces, and those traces are easy to miss if you are not looking for them. The deeper implication is not that ancient people were secretly modern, but that human intelligence has always been capable of more than we allow. Given time, stability, and motivation, complex solutions emerge. Given disruption, they vanish. Civilization is not a straight ascent. It is a waveform, rising and collapsing under pressures that repeat. These technological ghosts do not prove a lost golden age. They prove vulnerability. They show that progress can stall, reverse, and reset. They remind us that what we consider unprecedented may only be unprecedented in memory, not in reality. If knowledge has died before, it can die again. And if fragments of earlier worlds can confuse us millennia later, then our own legacy may one day be reduced to puzzling remnants, studied by future minds wondering how something so capable could disappear so completely. Water is the great eraser of human memory. It does not just destroy, it hides. When coastlines flood, they do not leave ruins standing like broken cities in deserts. They swallow them whole, covering streets, homes, and harbors beneath layers of sand and silt. Over time, those layers harden, locking entire chapters of history beneath the sea. If civilization once flourished along ancient shores, as most human societies have, then the ocean floor is not empty. It is crowded with forgotten worlds. At the end of the last ice age, Earth underwent one of the most dramatic transformations in its recent history. Vast ice sheets that had covered much of the northern hemisphere began to collapse as global temperatures rose. Sea levels did not rise slowly and politely. They surged upward in pulses, sometimes several meters within a human lifetime. Over the course of a few thousand years, oceans climbed more than 100 meters. Coastlines retreated inland by hundreds of kilometers. Entire regions where people had lived for generations vanished beneath the waves. For those who experienced it, this was not gradual change. It was catastrophe. Forests drowned, freshwater sources turned saline, familiar hunting grounds disappeared. Communities were forced to flee or perish. This was not a single event but a series of blows, each one rewriting the map. And yet, most reconstructions of early civilization place humanity safely inland, ignoring the fact that the most fertile and densely populated lands of the past are now underwater. Underwater archaeology has begun to reveal what this assumption hides. Off the coast of India, sonar surveys have detected geometric structures beneath the Arabian Sea. Some researchers associate them with ancient cities described in early texts, places said to have been consumed by the ocean. While interpretations remain debated, the scale of the remains suggests organized construction, not natural formations. Streets, foundations, and right angles do not arise by chance on the seafloor. In the Mediterranean, the evidence is less ambiguous. Submerged ports, breakwaters, and settlements lie along coasts that once sat higher than today's sea level. Some date back 5,000 years or more. They show road grids, building foundations, and harbor infrastructure. These were not primitive camps, they were urban environments now preserved in silence beneath shallow water. In the Black Sea, a particularly dramatic hypothesis emerged from geological studies. Evidence suggests that this body of water was once a freshwater lake isolated from the Mediterranean. As melting ice raised global sea levels, pressure built until seawater breached the natural barrier at the Bosphorus. When it broke, salt water poured in with tremendous force, transforming the lake into a sea within months. Shorelines drowned rapidly. Villages would have been overwhelmed almost instantly. This kind of event does not require imagination to become legend. Survivors fleeing inland would carry stories of a world swallowed by water, of lands lost overnight, of a boundary between safety and chaos marked by rising waves. Passed down through generations, such memories would not preserve geography but emotion, fear, loss and renewal. Over time, they would become the flood myths that appear across cultures separated by vast distances. These myths are remarkably consistent. They describe not local floods but total ones, waters rising higher than mountains, humanity reduced to a few survivors, a reset of the world. When these stories are dismissed as symbolic, something is missed. Symbols come from experience. The scale may grow in retelling, but the core event remains anchored in reality. The sea does not just preserve cities, it preserves evidence of human adaptation. Ancient shorelines can be traced beneath modern oceans, revealing where people once lived, fished, and traded. Stone tools have been found on submerged continental shelves far from current coasts. These are not anomalies, they are markers of landscapes erased. What makes this relevant to the idea of earlier civilizations is not romance but probability. Humans favor coasts. They offer food, transportation, moderate climate, and connection. If complex societies emerged earlier than we think, they would almost certainly have concentrated along shorelines. Those shorelines are now gone. Their cities would not erode into visible ruins. They would be sealed away. Technology now allows us to glimpse these lost environments. Side-scan sonar maps sea floors with acoustic shadows. Submersible drones capture high-resolution imagery. Sediment cores reveal human activity through charcoal, pollen changes, and chemical traces. Each advancement peels back another layer of ignorance. And with each discovery, the assumption of an empty prehistoric ocean becomes harder to defend. The resistance to this idea often comes from habit, not evidence. For centuries, archaeology focused on dry land because that was where tools were. What lay underwater was inaccessible and expensive to study. Absence of exploration became absence of belief. Now that exploration is possible, belief must adapt. The sea level rise at the end of the Ice Age was not the only time water erased civilization. Earth's history includes repeated episodes of flooding, subsidence, and tectonic shifts. Earthquakes can drop coastlines meters in minutes. Tsunamis can scour settlements beyond recognition. These events do not leave tidy ruins. They scatter debris, bury foundations, and reset landscapes. Even in recorded history, entire cities have vanished into the sea. Some were known only through texts until rediscovered underwater. Others remain lost. Multiply that process by 10,000 years, and the likelihood of undiscovered civilizations increases, not decreases. What matters is not whether a specific legendary city existed exactly as described, but whether the conditions for widespread loss were present. They were. Sea level rise, rapid meltwater pulses, and coastal collapse created a bottleneck in human development. Knowledge would have been fragmented. Survivors would rebuild with less, not more. Complexity would contract before expanding again. This reframes early monuments on land. Structures built on high ground may not represent the birth of civilization, but its retreat. They may have been constructed by people fleeing drowned worlds, carrying fragments of memory, skill, and symbolism. High places become sacred not by accident, but by survival. The ocean keeps its secrets well. It does not advertise what it has taken, but the patterns are clear. Where water rose, history fell silent. And silence is not emptiness. It is compression, stories flattened into myth, cities pressed into sediment, timelines broken. If civilization resets, water is often the trigger, not a gentle flood, but a boundary crossed too fast to adapt. And if that has happened before more than once, then the map of human history is incomplete by design. The missing pieces are not lost in libraries, they are resting beneath the waves, waiting for us to accept that the past may be far deeper than the shorelines we stand on today. Catastrophe does not negotiate with civilization. It arrives without regard for achievement, belief, or preparation, and when it does, complexity collapses first. The deeper the system, the more fragile it becomes. History remembers empires falling to armies and politics, but long before human conflict enters the story, Earth itself has rewritten the rules through events so vast they barely fit inside the human mind. Geology records these moments with brutal clarity. The planet's past is punctuated by mass extinctions, periods when life itself was nearly erased. Over the last 540 million years, at least 5 such events wiped out between 70 and 95% of all species. Forests vanished, oceans emptied, entire evolutionary branches ended forever. After each collapse, life returned, but not as it was before. The reset was total. The most devastating of these occurred roughly 252 million years ago, at the boundary between the Permian and Triassic periods. Volcanic eruptions in what is now Siberia spewed trillions of tons of carbon dioxide and sulfur into the atmosphere over hundreds of thousands of years. The result was runaway warming, acidified oceans, and collapsing ecosystems. Almost all complex life died. It took millions of years for biodiversity to recover. If a civilization had existed before such an event, it would not merely have fallen, it would have been erased. More familiar is the extinction that ended the reign of the dinosaurs 66 million years ago. A space rock roughly 10 kilometers wide struck the Earth with energy equivalent to billions of nuclear weapons. The impact triggered global firestorms, mega tsunamis, and a prolonged darkness as debris blocked sunlight. Photosynthesis failed. Food chains collapsed. 75% of species vanished. Dominant life forms were removed from the board in an instant. This matters because civilization, no matter how advanced, is tied to biology. It depends on stable ecosystems, predictable climate, and functioning food systems. Remove those and cities become liabilities. Technology does not feed itself. Knowledge does not protect against starvation. When the environment fails, culture follows. Even events smaller than mass extinctions can devastate humanity. Around 74,000 years ago, a supervolcano erupted on the island of Sumatra. The explosion was so violent that ash fell across much of the planet. Sunlight dimmed, global temperatures dropped dramatically. This volcanic winter may have lasted years, followed by centuries of climatic instability. Genetic evidence suggests that human populations shrank to a few thousand individuals. Our species nearly vanished. This bottleneck is written into our DNA. Modern humans share striking genetic similarity because we all descend from this narrow group of survivors. Civilization could not have existed during this period. Even if it had begun, it would have been extinguished. Knowledge would not survive a reduction that severe. Oral traditions fracture, skills disappear, tools become irrelevant when survival is reduced to its most basic form. These are not rare anomalies. Earth experiences super-eruptions, asteroid impacts, and climate shocks on timescales shorter than human history. The planet is not stable over millennia. It oscillates between extremes. Ice ages advance and retreat. Deserts expand and contract. Monsoons shift. Sea levels rise and fall. Each transition stresses human societies, and extreme transitions break them. Smaller disasters leave clearer archaeological traces. A drought can be traced through pollen records, a flood through sediment layers, a fire through charcoal deposits. Larger ones blur everything. When ecosystems collapse globally, the signal overwhelms the detail. Human activity becomes noise inside a planetary scream. This perspective reframes the idea of civilization resets. They are not speculative. They are expected outcomes in a system shaped by violence at scales beyond human control. The only question is how often human societies reach complexity before being knocked back. Critics often argue that we would see obvious evidence of past advanced societies, such as pollution or large-scale environmental alteration, but this assumes permanence. In reality, the planet absorbs disturbance, forests regrow, oceans rebalance, carbon cycles normalize. After enough time, even dramatic changes blend into the background. The irony is that our own era is producing exactly the kinds of signals future scientists might misinterpret: rapid warming, altered isotope ratios, widespread synthetic materials. If civilization collapses and millions of years pass, future observers might attribute these markers to natural events, just as we do when examining the deep past. The line between natural and artificial blurs under pressure. Catastrophe also reshapes memory. Survivors do not carry blueprints, they carry stories. After a disaster, meaning matters more than mechanics. The narrative of destruction and renewal becomes sacred. Knowledge that does not serve immediate survival fades. Over generations, myth replaces explanation. This process is visible in recorded collapses. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire, infrastructure decayed, roads cracked, aqueducts failed, literacy declined, knowledge centralized in a few institutions and then scattered. Europe did not return to Roman engineering standards for centuries. This collapse occurred without asteroid impacts or supervolcanoes. It happened through political fragmentation and economic strain. Scale that vulnerability up to global catastrophe, and the loss becomes nearly absolute. Civilization is not resilient by default. It is a delicate arrangement balanced on surplus and stability. Remove either, and complexity becomes a burden. Specialization fails, trade breaks, expertise dies with experts. What remains is improvisation. If humanity has experienced multiple near-extinction events, and it has, then the idea that civilization emerged only once and climbed uninterrupted to the present becomes less convincing. More plausible is a pattern of ascent and collapse, with each cycle leaving fewer traces than the last. Earth does not reset neatly. It grinds, it compresses, it overwrites. And it does not care whether the marks it erases were left by bacteria, dinosaurs, or cities. Catastrophe is the great equalizer, reducing complexity to baseline and allowing evolution, cultural or biological, to begin again. Seen through this lens, the silence of deep history is not evidence against earlier civilizations. It is the expected outcome of a planet that has never been gentle. If intelligence emerges often enough and catastrophe strikes regularly enough, then forgetting is not failure. It is the default state of a world that has been resetting itself long before humans ever learned to write. Climate does not collapse civilizations with drama. It does so quietly through seasons that fail, rivers that shrink, and patterns that no longer repeat. Empires often fall long before their people understand what is happening. By the time the collapse becomes visible, the cause has already passed the point of correction. History records wars and invasions, but climate change is the invisible force that usually weakens societies first, turning stability into fragility. Long before modern industry, Earth's climate shifted abruptly and repeatedly. These shifts were not gentle trends, they were sharp deviations that unfolded over decades, sometimes faster than a single generation could adapt. Agriculture, the foundation of complex society, is especially vulnerable to such instability. Crops depend on predictable rainfall, stable temperatures, and seasonal rhythm. When those rhythms break, surplus disappears, and without surplus, civilization unravels. One of the clearest examples comes from the ancient Maya. For centuries, Maya cities thrived in the lowlands of Central America. They built towering pyramids, developed a complex writing system, mastered astronomy, and governed dense populations. Their cities were not built near large rivers. Instead, they relied on rainfall stored in reservoirs and natural sinkholes. This system worked brilliantly until it didn't. Between the 9th and 10th centuries, the region experienced a series of prolonged droughts. Climate records extracted from lake sediments and cave formations showed dramatic drops in rainfall, some lasting decades. Reservoirs dried, crops failed, food shortages spread. Political authority, which depended on the ability of rulers to mediate between people and the gods, collapsed. Within a century, major cities were abandoned. The jungle reclaimed them, sealing their fall beneath vegetation. The Maya did not vanish, their civilization did. Survivors dispersed into smaller communities carrying fragments of language, ritual, and identity, but losing the centralized systems that supported monumental construction and scientific record-keeping. Knowledge did not disappear overnight, but without institutions to preserve it, it degraded. Complexity gave way to resilience. This pattern repeats across time and geography. Around 4,200 years ago, a major climate event struck the Northern Hemisphere. Scientists identify it through dust layers, reduced river flow, and isotopic changes in sediments. Rainfall declined sharply across the Middle East, North Africa, and South Asia. At the same time, some of the world's earliest civilizations collapsed. In Mesopotamia, the Akkadian Empire fell apart. Cities dependent on irrigation were overwhelmed by dust storms and salinized fields. Written records describe hunger and chaos. In Egypt, the Old Kingdom ended abruptly. The Nile's flood cycles failed repeatedly, undermining the agricultural system that supported pyramid-building pharaohs. In the Indus Valley, once home to meticulously planned cities with advanced sanitation, urban life fragmented and dispersed. These collapses were not coordinated, They were not caused by a single enemy. They unfolded independently under the same environmental stress. Climate acted as a synchronizing force, exposing the limits of human control. Once again, civilization did not vanish everywhere, but it reset. Urban complexity declined. Writing systems were lost or simplified. Long-distance trade collapsed. The Late Bronze Age collapse offers another illustration. Around 1200 BCE, nearly every major civilization in the eastern Mediterranean fell within a few generations. Palaces burned, cities were abandoned. Writing disappeared in some regions for centuries. For decades, explanations focused on invasions by mysterious sea peoples. But recent climate studies point to prolonged drought as the deeper cause. Tree ring data and pollen records indicate severe and sustained aridity across the region. Harvests failed, famines spread, populations migrated in desperation, destabilizing neighboring societies. Trade networks broke down, cutting off access to critical resources like tin, essential for bronze production. The collapse cascaded through interconnected systems, bringing down empires that had stood for centuries. What these cases share is not weakness, but specialization. The more complex a society becomes, the more it depends on stable inputs. Climate variability attacks that stability. When food systems fail, everything built on top of them follows. Technology, governance, religion, and culture cannot compensate for empty granaries. This has profound implications for the idea of forgotten civilizations. If climate change alone can erase urban societies within a century, then earlier civilizations exposed to even more dramatic shifts would have left little trace. Ice Age transitions, monsoon reconfigurations, and abrupt cooling events would have forced repeated resets long before written history. Climate also reshapes landscapes in ways that hide evidence. Desertification buries cities in sand, floodplains erase foundations with sediment, rising seas drown coastlines. When climate changes, archaeology becomes harder, not easier. What survives does so by accident. Modern science reveals that climate does not change smoothly, it jumps. Ice cores show rapid temperature swings over decades. Ocean circulation can shut down or restart suddenly. These shifts would have been incomprehensible to ancient societies, experienced as divine punishment or cosmic disorder. Such experiences leave psychological scars. Myths of angry gods, cycles of destruction, and rebirth often emerge after environmental collapse. These stories encode lived experience, not fantasy. They preserve the emotional truth of loss even when technical details vanish. The lesson is not that ancient people were helpless, they adapted where they could, but adaptation has limits. When thresholds are crossed, systems fail. Civilization is not a permanent state, it is a temporary alignment between human ambition and environmental tolerance. Seen this way, the rise of civilization looks less like a singular miracle and more like a recurring experiment. Sometimes conditions allow it to flourish, sometimes they do not. When they don't, humanity falls back, reorganizes and tries again, carrying forward whatever fragments survive. If climate has reset civilization multiple times within the last 10,000 years, then over the full span of human existence, the number of resets could be far greater. Each reset would compress history, erasing detail, leaving only hints. The absence of ancient cities older than our known timeline is not evidence that they never existed. It is consistent with a world where climate instability repeatedly dismantles complexity. Civilization emerges not as a destiny, but as a fragile phase, always temporary, always contingent, and always at risk of being quietly undone by a planet that never stops changing. Myth is often treated as the opposite of history, a space where imagination replaces fact. But myth does not emerge from nothing. It forms when memory outlives explanation. When events are too vast, too traumatic, or too poorly understood to be recorded as data, they are preserved as story. Across the world, cultures separated by oceans and millennia share strikingly similar myths, not in detail, but in structure. These patterns suggest not coincidence, but compression. History distilled into narrative. Flood stories appear almost everywhere humans have lived, not local floods, not seasonal inundations, but total ones. Stories of water rising beyond control, of lands erased, of humanity reduced to a handful of survivors. In Mesopotamia, a man is warned to build a vessel to survive the deluge. In South Asia, a king is guided by a divine being in fish form to escape rising waters. In China, ancient rulers struggle to contain a flood that threatens the entire world. In the Americas, survivors climb mountains or float in canoes as the old world disappears. These stories are not identical, but their shared elements are too specific to ignore. A sudden catastrophe, moral or cosmic imbalance, survival through foresight, renewal afterward. This is not how fiction spreads. This is how memory behaves when it loses context, but retains emotional truth. Geology provides a plausible source. At the end of the last ice age, rising seas drowned coastal plains across the globe. These plains were not marginal lands. They were the most productive environments available to early humans. Rivers met oceans there. Food was abundant. Travel was easy. Communities grew dense. When the sea rose, it did not just displace people, it destroyed their world. For generations, survivors would have told their children what was lost, not with measurements or maps, but with meaning. The sea rose, the land vanished. Only those who listened survived. Over time, the story hardened. Gods replaced glaciers. Punishment replaced physics, but the core remained. Flood myths are not the only recurring pattern. Many cultures describe earlier ages, often multiple, that ended in catastrophe. These ages are sometimes associated with different materials, different beings, or different moral qualities. Stone, bronze, gold, giants, heroes, demigods, fire, water, darkness. Each age ends, a new one begins. This cyclical view of history contrasts sharply with the modern idea of linear progress, yet it appears independently across civilizations. In Mesoamerica, time was seen as a series of worlds, each destroyed and recreated. In South Asia, vast cycles called yugas describe repeated rises and falls of civilization over immense spans of time. In ancient Greece, philosophers spoke of recurring destructions by fire and flood that reset humanity. These are not scientific models, but they are not random. They reflect lived experience of collapse and renewal. People who have seen their world end do not believe in permanence, they believe in cycles. Even myths of lost continents follow this pattern. Stories of advanced lands swallowed by the sea appear in multiple traditions. These are often dismissed as fantasy because no such continents exist today. But the stories rarely describe continents as geologists define them. They describe regions, islands, or cultural centers lost to water. Over generations, scale inflates. What was once a coastline becomes a kingdom, then a world. The mechanism is simple. Trauma magnifies memory. Loss grows larger in retelling. What matters is not precision, but impact. The disappearance of a homeland feels total to those who lose it, regardless of its actual size. Myth also preserves warnings. Many stories emphasize hubris, imbalance, or forgetting sacred laws. These are not moral lessons invented after the fact, they are reflections of helplessness. When catastrophe strikes without warning, people search for meaning. Cause is assigned to behavior because randomness is intolerable. The story becomes instruction. Do not forget, do not repeat, do not assume safety. This is how civilizations encode survival lessons without science. Myth is not false, it is pre-analytical. It carries pattern without mechanism. Critics argue that myths are too mutable to be trusted. They change, they absorb new elements. This is true, but change does not erase origin, it layers it. A myth that survives for thousands of years does so because it remains relevant. Its persistence is evidence of resonance, not fabrication. Modern societies still do this. Events like global wars, pandemics, and disasters quickly generate narratives larger than fact. Symbols replace statistics. Heroes and villains emerge. Within decades, complexity collapses into story. Given enough time, even documented events become mythologized. The difference with ancient myths is not reliability, but age. They have passed through more hands, more languages, more worldviews. What remains is what mattered most. If humanity has experienced repeated collapses, then myth becomes the only long-term archive capable of surviving them. Stone can erode, text can burn, DNA mutates. But stories adapt, they move, they hide inside culture. This does not mean every myth is a record of a lost civilization. But it does mean dismissing all myth as fiction ignores how human memory works under stress. When writing fails, storytelling takes over. When explanation fails, symbolism remains. The consistency of certain themes suggests shared experiences, not shared imagination. Flood, fire from the sky, darkness, long winters. These align closely with known natural catastrophes. They also align with genetic bottlenecks and archaeological gaps. Myth fills the spaces where evidence is thin. It does not replace evidence, but it points toward questions worth asking. Why do so many cultures remember destruction as cyclical? Why do they speak of knowledge lost and regained? Why is the past so often described as greater, not smaller? Perhaps because people have lived through decline often enough to recognize the pattern. Progress feels fragile when you have seen it break. Permanence feels like illusion when your grandparents remember a different world. If civilization resets, myth is the scar tissue left behind. It does not tell us how things worked. It tells us that they ended. It reminds us that forgetting is not just possible, but normal. Seen this way, myth is not evidence of fantasy, but of repetition. It is humanity's way of saying, across thousands of years and countless tongues, that this has happened before. Above every civilization hangs a constant presence that feels stable only because human lifespans are short. The sun appears reliable, rising and setting with comforting regularity, but on longer scales it is restless. Its behavior follows cycles that can alter climate, disrupt technology, and stress ecosystems in ways that ripple through human history. These cycles are not speculative, they are measurable, recorded in ice cores, tree rings, and historical observations. And when aligned with moments of social collapse, they reveal a pattern that is difficult to ignore. The most familiar solar rhythm lasts about 11 years, marked by fluctuations in sunspot activity. Sunspots are regions of intense magnetic disturbance, and when they increase, the sun becomes more volatile. Solar flares and coronal mass ejections follow, sending charged particles racing toward Earth. Most of the time, our planet's magnetic field absorbs this assault. But the energy still interacts with the upper atmosphere, subtly affecting climate systems and radiation levels. Beyond this short cycle exist longer ones, stretching across decades and centuries. One such cycle lasts roughly 80 to 90 years, modulating the strength of the 11-year rhythm. Even more consequential is a cycle of approximately 200 years, during which solar activity can remain suppressed for generations. The most dramatic of these extended quiet periods are known as grand solar minima. During a grand minimum, sunspots nearly vanish. Solar output declines slightly, but enough to matter. Earth cools, atmospheric circulation shifts. Weather becomes erratic, crops fail more often. These effects are not hypothetical, they are documented. Between the mid-17th and early 18th centuries, Europe experienced such a period. Winters grew longer and harsher, rivers froze regularly, glaciers advanced, harvests failed repeatedly. Famine and unrest followed. This era coincided with widespread social stress, war, and demographic decline. The climate shift did not cause these crises alone, but it intensified every existing weakness. Earlier minima align with similar disruption. Periods of reduced solar activity coincide with episodes of cooling, drought, and instability across multiple regions. These correlations appear in tree growth patterns which record annual climate conditions, and in isotopic data trapped in polar ice. The sun's rhythm leaves fingerprints on Earth systems, and those fingerprints overlap with moments when civilization struggled or collapsed. Solar influence is not limited to gradual cooling. Extreme solar events pose a more immediate threat. On rare occasions, the sun releases an enormous burst of energy that slams into Earth's magnetic field. In the modern era, such an event was observed in the 19th century. Telegraph systems sparked, caught fire, and failed across continents. Auroras lit the sky at latitudes where they are never seen. Had this event occurred in today's electrified world, the damage would have been global and severe. Ancient societies did not rely on power grids, but they were not immune. Intense solar storms can disrupt climate temporarily, alter atmospheric chemistry, and increase radiation exposure. Over time, repeated disturbances could contribute to environmental stress. More importantly, societies without scientific frameworks would experience such events as supernatural terror. The sky would glow. Compasses, if present, would fail. Animals might behave strangely. Crops could be affected indirectly. These experiences would be seared into memory. This may explain why myths across cultures describe skies on fire, suns behaving strangely, or celestial battles preceding disaster. While often symbolic, such imagery aligns with real astronomical phenomena. A society already strained by climate or resource scarcity could be pushed past a tipping point by events it could not predict or understand. Solar cycles also interact with Earth's own systems. Changes in solar output influence ocean circulation and atmospheric patterns. Small shifts can amplify existing trends, turning manageable droughts into prolonged ones, or stable climates into unpredictable regimes. When food systems depend on consistency, unpredictability becomes lethal. The key insight is not that the sun alone destroys civilizations, but that it acts as a trigger, an amplifier. It nudges systems already under stress into failure. It shortens margins. It turns resilience into vulnerability. If civilization has risen and fallen multiple times, solar variability would have been a recurring background force. Its cycles span centuries and millennia, aligning uncomfortably well with the timescales of cultural memory loss. A society weakened by cooling or drought might collapse, leaving behind stories of divine anger or cosmic imbalance. The scientific cause would be forgotten, the narrative would remain. Modern science has only recently begun to understand these connections. For most of history, the sun was worshipped, feared, or mythologized precisely because its power was felt but not measured. That intuition was not wrong, it was incomplete. Even today, despite satellites and monitoring, humanity remains vulnerable. Our technology has created new dependencies that solar activity can exploit. A severe solar storm could disable satellites, cripple communication, and disrupt global logistics. Civilization has become more complex, not more robust. Looking backward, this fragility suggests that earlier civilizations, even if less technologically advanced, were no safer. Without warning systems, without global coordination, a prolonged shift in solar behavior could undermine agriculture, trade, and stability over generations. Collapse would appear gradual to those living through it, sudden to those remembering it later. This perspective reframes ancient timelines. Periods of prosperity may align with solar stability. Periods of decline may coincide with prolonged solar minima. These patterns would not be obvious without modern tools, but they would shape human experience nonetheless. When combined with other forces, volcanic eruptions, climate shifts, rising seas, the sun becomes part of a larger system that periodically resets the conditions for civilization. Not through intent, not through judgment, but through physics. The danger of ignoring this is complacency. If collapse is framed solely as human failure, it feels preventable through better choices. If it is framed solely as natural disaster, it feels inevitable. The truth lies between. Civilizations fall when internal complexity meets external stress. Solar cycles are one source of that stress, recurring and indifferent. Ancient people watched the sky closely because it mattered. Their monuments align with celestial events. Their myths revolve around stars and suns. This was not superstition. It was survival awareness encoded in culture. If earlier civilizations existed and fell, the sun would have shone on their rise and dimmed during their decline, just as it does now. Its cycles would have shaped their fortunes, even if they lacked the language to describe why. The past, viewed through this lens, is not silent. It hums with rhythms that repeat, and among them, the slow pulse of our star stands as a reminder that even the most constant forces can change enough to alter the course of everything built beneath their light. Among all forces capable of resetting civilization, none arrives with less warning than the sky itself. Space feels distant and abstract, yet Earth moves through a dense field of debris left over from planetary formation. Asteroids and comets cross our orbit constantly. Most burn up unnoticed, some do not. History makes one thing clear: it only takes one impact to change everything. 66 million years ago, an object roughly 10 kilometers wide struck Earth near what is now the Yucatan Peninsula. The energy released exceeded the combined power of every nuclear weapon humanity has ever built. Rock vaporized instantly. Shockwaves raced around the planet. Tsunamis, hundreds of meters high, tore across coastlines. Debris blasted into space and fell back through the atmosphere, igniting global firestorms. Dust and sulfur blocked sunlight for months or years. Photosynthesis collapsed. Food chains disintegrated. the dominant life forms on Earth vanished almost overnight. This event was not an anomaly. Earth's surface carries the scars of many large impacts. Craters erode, sink, or are swallowed by tectonic processes, but chemical fingerprints remain. Iridium, rare in Earth's crust yet common in asteroids, appears in distinct layers that mark moments when the sky collided with the ground. These events are part of Earth's operating system, not exceptions to it. For civilization, the danger lies not in rarity but in scale. Smaller impacts occur far more often. They may not erase most life, but they can devastate regions, destabilize climate, and fracture societies. Near the end of the last ice age, evidence suggests fragments of a cosmic body exploded over North America. This period aligns with abrupt cooling, widespread wildfires, and the disappearance of large animals. Human cultures at the time show sudden disruption. Whether or not every detail is resolved, the coincidence of timing is difficult to dismiss. In the early 20th century, a cosmic object exploded over Siberia with the force of a large nuclear weapon. The blast flattened tens of millions of trees across thousands of square kilometers. No crater was left, only devastation. Had it occurred over a populated region, an entire city would have been erased in seconds. No warning was given, no defense was possible. A century later, a smaller object entered Earth's atmosphere above a modern city and detonated mid-air. The shockwave shattered windows across a wide area and injured more than 1,000 people. Again, detection came too late. Even with satellites and sensors, the object went unnoticed until it exploded. These examples scale upward. Objects capable of global disruption strike on timescales of tens or hundreds of thousands of years. Human civilization has existed for only a fraction of that. Statistically, impacts large enough to cause severe global consequences are not hypothetical. They are inevitable given enough time. For earlier civilizations, the risk would have been absolute. Without telescopes, without warning systems, without scientific frameworks, an impact would appear as divine violence, a fireball crossing the sky, an explosion louder than thunder, darkness at midday, crops failing in the seasons that followed, regions burned, coastlines flooded, populations displaced. Survivors would have no language for orbital mechanics, only stories of fire from above. Cosmic impacts do more than destroy infrastructure. They shatter continuity. Trade networks collapse, populations migrate, specialists die, writing materials burn, libraries vanish. Even if survivors endure, the systems that maintain complexity fail. A civilization can unravel within a few generations once its informational backbone is broken. What makes impacts uniquely effective at resetting civilization is their indifference. They do not target weakness, they overwhelm strength. The most advanced societies, concentrated in cities and dependent on dense systems, become the most vulnerable. Smaller, scattered groups may survive, but with reduced capacity to preserve knowledge. Over time, memory distorts. Fire from the sky becomes myth. Stars falling become legend. Gods hurl thunderbolts. The physical cause disappears, but the emotional truth remains. Destruction came from above. It was sudden. It ended an age. These patterns appear repeatedly in global mythology. Stories of burning skies, falling stars, and worlds destroyed by fire are widespread. They are often paired with floods, as impacts can trigger massive tsunamis and abrupt climate shifts. Fire and water together mark endings in cultural memory. From a scientific perspective, the aftermath of an impact is often as devastating as the collision itself. Dust injected into the atmosphere can cool the planet rapidly. Rainfall patterns shift, growing seasons shorten, ecosystems collapse far from the impact site. A civilization already stressed by drought, cooling, or resource depletion may not survive the added pressure. The point is not to assign every ancient collapse to a specific impact. It is to recognize that this mechanism exists, has operated repeatedly, and requires no regard for human achievement. Civilization does not need to be ancient to be erased. It only needs to be unlucky. Even today, humanity remains exposed. Detection programs track many near-Earth objects, but detection does not guarantee prevention. Deflection technologies are experimental. Global coordination is fragile. Our confidence rests on probability, not protection. If modern civilization struggles to defend itself, earlier ones would have had no chance. Their survival would depend entirely on chance alignment. A near miss allows continuity. A direct hit forces reset. Over deep time, chance evens out. Enough impacts occur to ensure repeated disruption. Intelligence may emerge, societies may rise, but none are protected forever. When the sky finally strikes, it does not leave explanations behind. It simply clears the board, leaving silence where complexity once stood, and space for the next cycle to begin. Few ideas grip the human imagination as powerfully as the notion of a vanished advanced world, erased so completely that only whispers remain. Among these whispers, one story has endured longer and traveled farther than almost any other. The tale of a powerful civilization destroyed in a single catastrophic event and swallowed by the sea. Over time, this story has been treated as allegory, cautionary fable, or pure invention. Yet when stripped of embellishment, what remains aligns disturbingly well with known patterns of loss, memory, and environmental upheaval. The earliest detailed account of such a civilization comes from ancient Greece, recorded not as poetry, but as philosophy. The story describes a maritime power, technologically and politically advanced, whose reach extended across vast regions. Its downfall came suddenly, through earthquakes and floods so severe that the land itself vanished beneath the water. What survived was not the civilization, but the memory of its destruction passed down through intermediaries who claimed the account was far older than their own culture. For centuries, this story has been dismissed on the grounds that no such continent exists today. But this objection misunderstands both geology and storytelling. Continents do not need to vanish entirely for civilizations to be lost. Coastlines collapse, islands sink, low-lying regions disappear. When memory stretches across thousands of years, geography blurs. A drowned coastal empire becomes, in retelling, a lost land. Geology confirms that such losses are not hypothetical. At the end of the last ice age, sea levels rose dramatically, flooding continental shelves worldwide. Regions that had been dry land for tens of thousands of years vanished beneath shallow seas. These areas were not empty. They were ideal for human settlement, offering access to fresh water, marine resources, fertile soils, and trade routes. If complex societies developed there, their physical remains would now lie underwater, buried beneath sediment. Volcanic activity adds another layer. Massive eruptions can collapse islands, generate tsunamis, and alter regional climates in a matter of days. In the Bronze Age, a volcanic explosion in the Mediterranean destroyed a thriving island culture and sent shockwaves across the region. Cities were buried in ash, coastlines were ravaged by waves, trade networks collapsed. While this event did not erase all connected civilizations, it weakened them enough that recovery was incomplete. Over generations, memory exaggerated scale and consequence, transforming a regional catastrophe into a world-ending myth. This process is not deception, it is compression. When societies lose writing, measurement, and historical continuity, experience is preserved through narrative. Precision fades, meaning remains. A destroyed island becomes a destroyed world because for those who lived there, it was. Underwater archaeology increasingly supports the idea that human history extends beyond current shorelines. Sonar mapping has revealed submerged cities, ports, roads, and walls in seas around the world. These sites show urban planning, infrastructure, and long-term habitation. They were not temporary camps, they were centers of life that vanished when the water rose. What remains striking is how often these discoveries are treated as isolated curiosities rather than parts of a broader pattern. Each submerged city is explained individually, rarely connected to the global story of rising seas and displaced populations. Yet when viewed together, they suggest that large portions of early human development occurred in places now inaccessible. This reframes the idea of lost civilizations. Instead of imagining a single advanced empire ruling the world, a more plausible picture emerges. Multiple regional societies, interconnected by trade and shared knowledge, thriving along coasts during a period of climatic stability. When that stability collapsed, so did the network. What followed was not extinction but fragmentation. Survivors fled inland, knowledge that required institutions faded, skills that depended on specialization vanished. What endured were stories of loss, warnings encoded in myth, and occasional remnants repurposed by later cultures who no longer understood their origin. This pattern explains why some ancient structures appear suddenly fully formed, without clear developmental stages. They may not represent the beginning of a tradition, but its end. Built by people preserving the last expressions of a knowledge system already under threat, these monuments stand as signatures of decline rather than ascent. It also explains why myths so often place lost civilizations in the distant past beyond known genealogies. Memory stretches until it breaks, then resets. What cannot be dated becomes timeless. What cannot be located becomes legendary. Skepticism toward these ideas often rests on a demand for total proof: intact cities, written records, unbroken timelines. But such demands ignore the conditions required for preservation. Catastrophe does not archive, it deletes. Expecting clean evidence after thousands of years of erosion, submergence, and tectonic motion misunderstands the nature of loss. What matters is not whether a specific legendary place existed exactly as described, but whether the conditions for widespread cultural erasure existed. They did. Rapid sea level rise, volcanic collapse, earthquakes, tsunamis, climate instability. Each alone can dismantle civilization. Together, they guarantee amnesia. Seen through this lens, stories of vanished worlds are not fantasies yearning for validation. They are cultural fossils, compressed memories of real events experienced by real people who lacked the tools to explain them scientifically, but understood their consequences intimately. The danger in dismissing these stories is not that we lose the past, but that we misunderstand the future. If civilization has been erased before by natural forces, then permanence is an illusion. If knowledge has been lost before, then progress is reversible. And if entire worlds can vanish beneath water and ash, then modern civilization stands no higher above oblivion than those that came before. The idea of a lost civilization is unsettling not because it challenges history, but because it challenges confidence. It suggests that what we call the beginning may be only the most recent chapter, and that beneath the surface, literally and metaphorically, lies a deeper, quieter record of worlds that rose, flourished, and disappeared without leaving a name we can pronounce today. Sometimes the most unsettling evidence is not what is found, but where it is found. Deep beneath forests, under layers of sediment, hidden by vegetation so dense it reshapes the land itself, traces of large-scale human organization have emerged in places long believed incapable of sustaining civilization. These discoveries dismantle one of archaeology's most enduring assumptions, that certain environments were too hostile, too chaotic, or too fragile for complex societies to exist. When that assumption collapses, entire timelines collapse with it. For centuries, vast tropical regions were treated as archaeological voids. Dense jungle, acidic soils, and rapid organic decay were thought to erase human presence almost immediately. Early explorers who described roads, cities, and managed landscapes were dismissed as unreliable or delusional. Later expeditions, finding no towering stone ruins piercing the canopy, reinforced the belief that these lands had always been sparsely inhabited. That certainty did not survive technology. When airborne laser scanning was applied to tropical forests, the jungle canopy stopped being an obstacle. Pulses of light passed through leaves and branches, striking the ground and returning detailed topographic data. What emerged from this process was not wilderness, but geometry. Straight lines where nature prefers curves, symmetry where randomness should dominate. Beneath dense forest cover appeared networks of roads, canals, causeways, plazas, reservoirs, and artificial hills. Entire urban systems revealed themselves where maps had once shown emptiness. These were not isolated villages or temporary camps. They were planned landscapes, shaped deliberately over centuries. Some settlements radiated outward from ceremonial centers like spokes on a wheel. Others were interconnected by raised roads designed to remain passable during floods. Population estimates based on these structures reached into the tens and even hundreds of thousands. This was not marginal habitation at the edge of survival. It was civilization operating at scale. These societies did not merely adapt to their environment, they engineered it. Soil was transformed into rich, dark earth through the controlled addition of organic material and charcoal, creating agricultural land that remains fertile centuries later. Wetlands were reshaped into managed fisheries. Water systems were built to store rainfall, regulate flooding, and stabilize food production. Roads were elevated to maintain connectivity during seasonal inundation. This was long-term planning executed with deep environmental knowledge. And then it ended. When outsiders eventually entered these regions centuries later, they encountered scattered communities surrounded by dense forest. The cities were gone. Roads vanished beneath roots. Earthworks softened into gentle hills. Without continuous maintenance, engineered landscapes reverted quickly. Within a few generations, the forest reclaimed nearly everything. The cause was not mysterious. Disease spread faster than any invading army. Populations collapsed before meaningful contact could even be recorded. With the loss of people came the loss of maintenance. Fields reverted to jungle, canals filled with silt, roads disappeared. What later observers mistook for untouched wilderness was in fact regrown forest, layered over the remains of a fallen civilization. This realization fundamentally changes how absence is interpreted. Lack of visible ruins no longer means lack of complexity. It means the materials used did not endure. It means collapse occurred faster than memory could preserve detail. It means archaeology searched for stone where earth and wood once carried civilization. Now extend this understanding deeper into the past. If societies built primarily from organic materials existed before major climate transitions, their survival in the archaeological record would be unlikely. Rising seas would drown them, forests would overgrow them, sediment would bury them, time would flatten them, only subtle patterns would remain, detectable only with tools capable of seeing through concealment. This reframes early human capability. Complexity does not require pyramids or metal tools. It requires coordination, planning, and the transmission of knowledge. Those qualities can flourish without producing monuments that resist decay. When such societies collapse, the loss can be nearly total. It also reframes sudden appearances in the historical record. When complex settlements seem to emerge without clear developmental stages, the usual explanation is rapid innovation. But another explanation exists. Earlier stages may be missing, not non-existent. They may lie hidden beneath environments that erase evidence efficiently. The jungle discoveries expose a deeper vulnerability. Even large, stable societies can vanish so completely that later generations believe the land was always empty. Memory does not scale with population. Once continuity breaks, size offers no protection against forgetting. This pattern repeats throughout human history. After collapse, survivors often disperse into smaller groups. Large-scale organization gives way to local resilience. Specialized knowledge disappears. Writing fades. Within centuries, what once existed becomes myth or silence. The forest, the desert, and the ocean perform the same function in different ways. They conceal. They smooth over disturbance. They erase evidence of complexity while preserving the illusion of primacy. What looks ancient and untouched may be neither. These insights force a reconsideration of early human history. If entire civilizations can vanish within a few hundred years, leaving little visible trace, then the absence of evidence for earlier complex societies becomes far less persuasive. It does not demonstrate non-existence. It demonstrates how effective certain environments are at hiding the past. Modern tools are only beginning to uncover these hidden layers. As detection technologies improve, more landscapes once dismissed as empty will be reclassified as engineered. Each discovery expands the known boundary of human capability and undermines the idea that civilization is a recent anomaly. The deeper lesson is not about lost cities, but about humility. History is incomplete by nature. It favors what survived by chance, not what mattered most. When environments destroy evidence faster than it can be preserved, silence fills the record. That silence does not mean nothing happened. It means something happened, that the Earth was exceptionally good at forgetting. There are moments when a single object destabilizes an entire historical timeline, not because it is spectacular, but because it refuses to behave as expected. Its age, its surface, and its physical condition contradict the story assigned to it. When this happens, the tension does not come from speculation, but from evidence that quietly disagrees with established chronology. Few examples illustrate this conflict more clearly than ancient monuments whose stone records an environment far older than the civilization credited with creating them. Carved directly from a limestone plateau overlooking the Nile Valley stands a massive figure aligned toward the rising sun. For generations it has been comfortably placed within a known dynastic period, treated as a symbol of royal authority and religious order. Yet the stone itself carries marks that do not match the climate of the last several thousand years. Its body is etched with deep vertical channels and rounded contours, patterns shaped not by wind-driven sand, but by sustained rainfall. Wind erosion in desert environments scours stone horizontally, sharpening edges and flattening exposed surfaces. Rain erosion behaves differently. Water flows downward, pooling and penetrating cracks, producing vertical grooves and soft, undulating forms over long periods. The erosion visible on this monument aligns precisely with the latter process. The problem is not subtle, it is physical. The region surrounding the structure has been arid for roughly 5,000 years. Geological and climatological data derived from sediment cores, fossilized pollen, and lake deposits show that heavy rainfall capable of producing such erosion last occurred near the end of the last ice age. This places the onset of erosion thousands of years earlier than the accepted construction date. Further examination reveals another inconsistency. The deepest weathering appears on the lower portions of the monument, while upper sections show less erosion. This suggests prolonged exposure followed by partial burial or repair. The head, in particular, appears disproportionately small relative to the body and exhibits different erosion patterns, implying it was reshaped at a later time. The stone tells a story of modification rather than original unity. These observations are not based on myth or interpretation. They arise from geology, hydrology, and comparative weathering, disciplines grounded in measurable processes. Stone responds to environment, not ideology. It records rainfall, temperature shifts, and exposure with indifference to human narratives. The discomfort emerges from implication. If the monument predates the civilization traditionally credited with its creation, then an organized society capable of large-scale stone carving must have existed earlier. That society would have required planning, labor coordination, symbolic tradition, and technical knowledge. Its absence from the written record would not negate its existence, only its preservation. This possibility challenges the idea that civilization emerged abruptly and recently. Instead, it suggests a deeper past marked by development, collapse, and reuse. Later cultures may have inherited structures whose origins they no longer understood, modifying them to fit new symbolic frameworks while preserving their physical form. This pattern appears repeatedly. Across the world, massive stone foundations lie beneath later constructions. Often the oldest stonework is the most precise, while later additions are smaller, rougher, and more decorative than functional. In a strictly linear model of progress, this inversion makes little sense. Skill should improve with time, not degrade. The more plausible explanation is inheritance without comprehension. Knowledge survived fragmentation, not continuity. Techniques were remembered partially, then ritualized. What began as engineering became symbolism. What was once functional became sacred. Attempts to dismiss these inconsistencies usually rely on isolated explanations. Lost techniques, unique genius, ceremonial excess. Each explanation may address a single case, but when similar anomalies appear across continents, cultures, and eras, they begin to form a coherent pattern. The pattern favors cycles rather than straight lines. Knowledge accumulates, peaks, collapses, and fragments. Survivors rebuild using memory rather than mastery. Over generations, fragments harden into tradition. The origin fades. The structure remains. The argument is not that ancient people possessed modern technology. It is that human capability has always been underestimated. Given stable climate and sufficient time, complex societies can emerge. Given disruption, they can vanish almost completely. Erosion-based evidence is especially powerful because it bypasses interpretation. Texts can be mistranslated, myths can be dismissed, stone cannot be persuaded. Water erosion leaves the same signature regardless of culture or belief. When it appears where it should not, timelines must either expand or deny the evidence. Denial is easier. It preserves established frameworks and avoids reopening settled questions. But progress in understanding has never come from comfort. It comes from anomalies that refuse to be ignored. The broader implication extends beyond a single monument. If one structure can survive from a forgotten age, altered and reused by later cultures, others may exist beneath cities, under sediment, or hidden in plain sight. Many may have been misdated or misunderstood simply because their existence complicates accepted narratives. Archaeology in this light is not a finished record but a partial one, shaped by preservation bias and environmental erasure. Entire chapters may be missing not because nothing happened, but because the conditions required to preserve evidence were rare. Stone endures longer than wood or earth, but even stone is not eternal. When it does survive, it speaks quietly through fractures, textures, and wear patterns rather than words. Listening requires patience and a willingness to question what seems settled. If civilization has reset multiple times, then such monuments are not anomalies. They are survivors, standing at the boundary between worlds, reused by those who inherited the aftermath rather than the cause. They are not misplaced. They are simply older than the story we have told about them. Civilization is often judged by what it builds, but it is shaped just as profoundly by what it remembers. Memory is the invisible structure that allows knowledge to accumulate rather than reset. When that structure fails, progress does not collapse outward in ruins. It collapses inward, quietly. Tools may survive, but understanding erodes. Words remain, but their meanings drift. Eventually, even the awareness that something was once known can disappear entirely. Human memory does not scale across catastrophe. It is local, fragile, and dependent on continuity. Writing extends memory beyond individuals. Institutions stabilize it. Education formalizes it. Remove these supports, and memory reverts to oral transmission, which prioritizes meaning over precision. Details blur first, sequences fracture next. What survives longest are symbols charged with emotion rather than information. This is why knowledge loss is often invisible archaeologically. When civilizations collapse, their most advanced ideas vanish first. Specialized knowledge depends on specialists. When those individuals die, scatter, or lose the ability to practice their craft, the knowledge ends with them. Basic skills can be relearned through necessity. Complex systems cannot. Precision astronomy, advanced mathematics, engineering principles, and abstract theory require uninterrupted teaching across generations. History shows this pattern repeatedly. After major political or economic collapses, literacy declines. Writing systems simplify or disappear. Architectural techniques degrade. Long-distance trade networks fracture, cutting off access to materials and ideas that supported complexity. What remains is not ignorance, but contraction. Societies retain what is essential for immediate survival and lose what depends on broader coordination. This narrowing explains why later cultures sometimes appear to forget what earlier ones clearly knew. Intelligence did not decline, transmission did. Knowledge is not genetic, it must be carried, taught, practiced, and reinforced. Without stable systems to support it, knowledge dissolves rapidly. Oral tradition becomes the bridge between collapse and continuity. When writing disappears or becomes inaccessible, societies compress knowledge into stories, rituals, and symbols. These forms are resilient, they survive disruption. But they trade technical accuracy for durability. Astronomical cycles become myths of gods crossing the sky. Historical floods transform into moral stories of renewal. Engineering ratios harden into sacred proportions. This transformation is not corruption, it is adaptation. Oral cultures preserve what matters socially and emotionally, not mechanically. They encode warnings, values, and identity. Loss occurs when later generations mistake symbolic memory for invention, forgetting that myth often begins as experience. The result leaves a recognizable signature. Knowledge appears ancient but unexplained. Practices persist without context. Structures are replicated without comprehension. Rituals remain long after their original function is forgotten. Over time, form survives while function disappears. Through this process, civilizations can inherit fragments of much older knowledge without knowing their origin. Monuments may align with celestial events long after the mathematical reasoning behind the alignment is lost. Proportions may be repeated because they feel correct, not because the calculations are remembered. Meaning survives, mechanism does not. Genetics reinforces this pattern. Human populations have passed through extreme bottlenecks, periods when numbers dropped so low that entire branches of cultural memory vanished. When population collapses occur, diversity of thought collapses with them. Traditions carried by small groups can disappear within a single generation. One such bottleneck nearly erased humanity tens of thousands of years ago. Genetic evidence shows that all modern humans descend from a remarkably small population. Any knowledge held outside that group was lost permanently. If earlier societies existed before such bottlenecks, their intellectual legacy would have ended completely, leaving no inheritors. Even without near extinction, migration fragments memory. When survivors scatter, shared knowledge becomes local. Without communication between groups, traditions diverge rapidly. Within centuries, common origin is forgotten, even if symbols remain superficially similar. This helps explain why related myths and symbols appear across distant cultures. They may not reflect direct contact, but shared inheritance from a much earlier time, filtered through repeated collapse and migration. Each retelling adapts to local conditions. The core persists, the details decay. It also explains why recorded history feels shallow. Written records rarely extend beyond a few thousand years, not because nothing happened earlier, but because the conditions required to preserve writing are rare. Writing demands surplus, stability, and centralized institutions. Remove anyone, and the record ends. Archaeology attempts to fill the gaps, but it too is selective. It favors durable materials and stable environments. Societies that built with wood, earth, or organic materials leave little trace. Societies that collapsed rapidly leave thin layers. The resulting picture is biased toward continuity rather than completeness. This bias reinforces the illusion of linear progress. What survives suggests steady advancement because the deepest collapses leave the least evidence. The more complete the erasure, the quieter the record. Knowledge loss, then, is not an anomaly. It is the default outcome of disruption. The survival of information across deep time is the exception. What reaches us from the past is not an archive, but scattered fragments that happen to endure. Seen through this lens, repeated resets of civilization are not extraordinary. They align with how memory behaves under stress. Societies rise, accumulate knowledge, and develop complexity. Catastrophe breaks continuity. Survivors adapt. Knowledge narrows. Memory compresses. Over time, complexity re-emerges from a reduced baseline. Each cycle generates its own myths and stories about what came before. Each believes itself near the beginning. Each underestimates the depth of the past because the evidence is incomplete. This does not diminish modern achievement. It contextualizes it. Our era feels unprecedented because our memory is intact. Deep time offers no such guarantee. It erases context without hesitation. If earlier civilizations existed, their disappearance would not require mystery or conspiracy. It would require only interruption. Memory would fail. Stories would adapt. Stone would endure. Humanity, unaware of what it had forgotten, would begin again, convinced that history was finally starting. Civilization tends to imagine itself as resilient because it measures strength in tools, structures, and accumulated knowledge. Yet resilience is not the same as durability. Durability depends on redundancy, flexibility, and the ability to absorb shock without losing coherence. History suggests that civilization rarely meets that standard. Instead, it behaves like a complex but brittle system, highly efficient under stable conditions and dangerously fragile when stressed. Complexity amplifies vulnerability. As societies grow, they specialize. Food production separates from consumption. Knowledge fragments into disciplines. Supply chains stretch across regions. Governance depends on communication and trust. Each layer increases capability, but it also increases dependency. When one layer fails, the effects cascade. What begins as disruption becomes collapse. This is not speculation. It is observable in every major historical breakdown. When food systems falter, cities suffer first. When trade routes fail, specialization becomes liability. When communication collapses, coordination disappears. A society that cannot coordinate cannot remain complex. Modern civilization exhibits this fragility at an unprecedented scale. It is globally interconnected, technologically dense, and reliant on continuous energy flow. Disruptions no longer remain local. A failure in one region ripples outward, affecting systems thousands of kilometers away. Stability now depends on uninterrupted function across the entire planet. Earlier civilizations were smaller, but they were not immune. Their complexity was lower, yet their margins were thinner. A drought lasting a decade could erase a city-state. A flood could collapse a regional economy. A volcanic eruption could destabilize multiple cultures simultaneously. Without global redundancy, recovery was slow or impossible. This vulnerability explains why collapse often appears sudden in hindsight. From within, decline feels gradual. Harvests weaken. Conflicts increase. Authority erodes. From the outside, layers fail in sequence until the structure gives way. Archaeology captures the moment of abandonment, not the years of strain that preceded it. One of the most dangerous illusions is that technology alone guarantees survival. Tools increase efficiency, but they also increase dependence. A society that cannot function without its tools is not stronger than one that can survive without them. It is merely faster. This illusion has repeated across history. Societies reach a level of sophistication that feels irreversible. Then a stressor arrives that was not anticipated. Climate shifts, trade collapses, disease spreads, conflict erupts. The very systems that enable growth accelerate collapse. This is why the idea of civilization resets is not radical. It is consistent with system behavior. When complexity exceeds resilience, collapse is not failure, it is outcome. What makes this especially relevant to deep history is scale. Over tens of thousands of years, rare events become inevitable. Droughts compound, sea levels shift, solar cycles fluctuate, impacts occur, volcanic winters return. Each event tests the system. Eventually, the test exceeds capacity. If humanity has existed for hundreds of thousands of years, and if complex societies can arise under favorable conditions, then multiple attempts would be expected. Some would fail early, some would reach impressive heights, none would be immune indefinitely. This perspective reframes ancient achievements. Instead of viewing them as isolated miracles, they become remnants of earlier equilibrium points, moments when environment, population, and knowledge aligned long enough to allow complexity. When alignment broke, collapse followed. It also reframes modern confidence. The belief that this time is different is a recurring feature of civilizations near their peak. The Romans believed their order eternal. The Maya built calendars that extended far beyond their political horizon. Every society assumes continuity because memory rarely includes complete collapse. Yet collapse does not announce itself. It erodes confidence slowly until one shock reveals how little resilience remains. When that happens, recovery is not guaranteed. It depends on how much knowledge survives, how many people remain, and whether conditions allow rebuilding. The danger is not that civilization will end permanently, but that it will reset. Each reset discards accumulated complexity. Each restart begins closer to baseline. Over deep time, this creates a sawtooth pattern rather than a steady climb. This pattern explains why progress appears uneven. Long periods of stability are punctuated by abrupt losses. Knowledge is rediscovered rather than invented. Techniques reappear with new names. Ideas return without memory of their origin. In this context, modern civilization is not the culmination of a linear journey. It is the current iteration of a repeating experiment. Its scale is unprecedented. Its fragility may be as well. The lesson embedded in deep history is not pessimism, it is caution. Resilience is not built by increasing complexity alone. It is built by redundancy, adaptability, and humility before forces beyond control. Ancient societies did not fail because they were foolish. They failed because the world changed faster than their systems could adapt. The same principle applies now. If earlier civilizations existed and collapsed, their lesson is not that progress is impossible, but that permanence is an illusion. Civilization is not a destination, it is a phase. Whether this phase endures depends less on how advanced tools become, and more on how well systems can absorb shock without losing coherence. History suggests that this balance is difficult to maintain. Deep time does not favor narratives of ascent. It favors cycles shaped by stress and recovery. Seen through that lens, the question is no longer whether civilization can fall, but how often it already has, and whether the present iteration has learned anything. from the silence left behind by those that came before. Civilization rarely recognizes itself as temporary while it is functioning. Permanence feels natural when systems work, when memory is intact, when yesterday resembles today closely enough to assume tomorrow will follow. Yet deep history suggests that this confidence is always provisional. What survives from the past is not a record of continuity, but a collection of fragments that endured interruption. From those fragments, each generation reconstructs a story that feels complete only because the missing pieces are invisible. What makes the present moment distinctive is not intelligence or technology, but awareness. For the first time, humanity possesses tools capable of detecting the forces that have undone civilizations before. We can measure climate shifts centuries in advance. We track objects moving through space. We monitor the sun's activity. We map fault lines, volcanoes, and ocean currents. And yet, awareness does not equal immunity. Knowing a system is fragile does not automatically make it resilient. The same patterns that shaped earlier collapses are visible now, amplified by scale. Climate instability threatens food systems. Sea levels rise toward densely populated coasts. Supply chains stretch across continents, efficient but brittle. Information travels instantly, but trust erodes just as fast. Complexity has increased, but so has dependency. The margin for error has not grown proportionally. What differs is speed. Earlier collapses unfolded over decades or centuries. Modern systems can unravel in years or even months. A single disruption can cascade globally. A localized failure becomes systemic almost immediately. The buffer time that once allowed adaptation has narrowed. This acceleration creates a paradox. The more advanced civilization becomes, the faster it can destabilize. Efficiency removes slack. Optimization eliminates redundancy. Resilience, which depends on excess capacity and flexibility, is often sacrificed for performance. What appears strong becomes brittle under stress. Deep history suggests that resets do not occur because societies lack intelligence, but because they overestimate control. Civilizations build models of the world that work under familiar conditions. When conditions change beyond the model's assumptions, failure follows. The collapse feels sudden, not because it was unpredictable, but because prediction was ignored. Earlier societies encoded their awareness of fragility into myth, ritual, and taboo. These were not superstitions, but social technologies designed to limit behavior that might destabilize the system. Over time, as conditions stabilized, the original purpose of these constraints was forgotten. Ritual remained, meaning faded. Modern civilization relies instead on abstraction. Risk is quantified, probability replaces story. This approach is powerful, but it distances experience from consequence. When warnings are expressed as models rather than memories, they compete poorly with short-term incentives. The silence of the deep past is not empty, it is instructive. It tells us that collapse leaves little behind, that knowledge is fragile, that progress is reversible. It shows that civilization can rise high and still vanish without leaving a clear explanation. This does not mean collapse is inevitable. It means that continuity requires deliberate effort. Resilience must be designed, not assumed. Systems must tolerate failure without unraveling entirely. Knowledge must be preserved redundantly, not concentrated. Adaptability must be valued over efficiency. Earlier civilizations lacked the global perspective to attempt this. Their world was local. Their tools were limited, their collapses were often unavoidable. The present iteration is different only in opportunity. The question is whether opportunity will be used. If civilization has reset before, then the present is not unprecedented. It is rare, but not unique. What is unique is the chance to recognize the pattern while inside it. That recognition carries responsibility. Deep time does not judge intent, it records outcome. Civilizations that adapt leave traces. Those that do not leave silence. The difference is not morality or brilliance, but alignment with reality. One of the most persistent illusions is that civilization ends in spectacle, fire, flood, ruin. In truth, collapse often feels anticlimactic to those living through it. Systems degrade, services fail, norms erode, life continues, but smaller, narrower, more constrained. Only later does it acquire a narrative. If the present iteration fails, the future will not remember our achievements in detail. It will inherit fragments, altered climate, scattered materials, broken systems. Stories will form, explanations will simplify. The nuance will be lost. This is not a reason for despair, it is a reason for clarity. Understanding that civilization is temporary does not devalue it. It emphasizes stewardship. What matters is not permanence but transmission. The past does not warn us through words, it warns us through absence, through erased cities, through forgotten knowledge, through myths that speak of worlds ending and beginning again. Those are not fantasies, they are compressed histories. If earlier civilizations existed and fell, they are not asking to be rediscovered. They are reminding us that complexity alone is not survival. Memory, resilience, and humility matter more. The future will judge the present not by how advanced it was, but by whether it understood the fragility of what it built. Civilization is not a monument. It is a process. Processes can continue or they can reset. Deep time has shown repeatedly that resets are easy. Continuity is rare. Whether this cycle ends differently will depend on whether awareness becomes action and whether the lessons written in silence are finally read. At the far edge of any inquiry into the deep past lies a realization that is both unsettling and clarifying. History is not a record of what happened, but of what survived. Everything else is silence. The further back one looks, the louder that silence becomes, not because nothing occurred, but because the forces that shape the planet are exceptionally efficient at erasing complexity. This reframes the entire question of lost civilizations. The issue is no longer whether earlier societies could have existed, but whether we should expect to find them at all. Given erosion, submergence, tectonic recycling, climate collapse, and the fragility of memory, expecting abundant evidence becomes unreasonable. Survival, not achievement, determines what reaches the present. Civilization leaves behind two kinds of traces, physical and informational. Physical traces depend on material durability and environmental stability. Informational traces depend on uninterrupted transmission. Both are rare. When either fails, the past compresses. When both fail, it disappears entirely. Stone monuments endure only when conditions allow. Texts survive only when institutions persist. Most societies enjoy neither for long. A city built of earth and wood in a floodplain can vanish within decades. A culture that loses literacy can forget centuries of accumulated knowledge in a single generation. Over deep time, these losses compound until continuity dissolves. What remains are anomalies, structures that seem too old, technologies that appear too early, myths that feel strangely familiar, gaps where development should exist. None of these are proof by themselves. Together, they signal an incomplete record shaped by destruction rather than design. Modern thinking often demands certainty before reconsideration. But certainty is a privilege of short timescales. In deep time, probability matters more than proof, and probability favors repetition. If humans have existed for hundreds of thousands of years, and if complex societies can arise under favorable conditions, then multiple attempts are more likely than a single uninterrupted ascent. This does not require a hidden golden age or a lost global empire. It requires only that intelligence, opportunity, and stability aligned more than once. Each alignment would produce its own form of civilization, shaped by local conditions and constraints. Each would be vulnerable to disruption. Most would fail. Failure does not mean total extinction. It means contraction. Survivors adapt. Knowledge narrows, memory compresses. What was once technical becomes symbolic. Over time, complexity re-emerges, often unaware that it is retracing old ground. This pattern explains the strange blend of familiarity and ignorance that defines human history. Ideas are rediscovered rather than invented. Techniques reappear under new names. Mistakes repeat because their previous lessons were forgotten. Progress feels real, yet fragile. It also explains why confidence is always temporary. Civilization is contingent, not inevitable. It depends on conditions that can change faster than institutions can adapt. Stability is a phase, not a guarantee. Seeing civilization as cyclical is not pessimistic. It is descriptive. Cycles govern climate, geology, biology, and astronomy. There is no reason culture would be exempt. The error lies in believing the present moment represents an escape from patterns that shape the past. What distinguishes the current era is not immunity, but awareness. For the first time, humanity can detect the forces that shape long-term outcomes. Climate dynamics, orbital mechanics, solar variability, ecological limits, all are visible. We understand how fragile complex systems are. We have language for feedback loops, thresholds, and collapse. Yet awareness alone does not ensure survival. Understanding must become design. Systems must be built to fail gradually rather than catastrophically. Knowledge must be distributed rather than centralized. Memory must be preserved redundantly across media and generations. Resilience must matter more than optimization. Deep history suggests civilizations fail not because they lack intelligence, but because they misjudge risk. They prepare for familiar dangers and ignore systemic ones. They optimize for efficiency and sacrifice redundancy. They mistake recent experience for universal truth. The silence of the past is therefore not empty. It is instructive. It shows how quickly knowledge vanishes. It reveals that extraordinary achievement does not guarantee continuity. It demonstrates that collapse often leaves no explanation behind. If earlier civilizations existed and fell, they do not ask to be rediscovered. They offer context. They remind us that permanence is an illusion, that progress is reversible, and that forgetting is normal. The most dangerous assumption is that history begins with us, that everything before was simple or irrelevant. This belief flatters the present while blinding it to warning signs. It encourages the idea that collapse happens elsewhere under different conditions to other people. Deep time disagrees. It reveals a landscape shaped by repeated experiments in complexity. Some succeed briefly, some fail quietly. A few leave traces that puzzle future observers. most leave nothing at all. The future will treat the present the same way. It will inherit fragments shaped by chance. It will reconstruct narratives from what survives. It will misunderstand much of what mattered. And it will likely believe, as every civilization has, that it stands at the edge of history rather than within a long sequence of attempts. This is not a call to despair. It is a call to perspective. Civilization is not a monument meant to endure untouched. It is a process that must be maintained. Maintenance requires effort, foresight, and humility. Before forces larger than any society, the past does not promise permanence. It offers pattern. Those patterns show that continuity is rare, collapse is common, and memory is fragile. They also show that awareness creates possibility. Whether this iteration becomes another silence in the record or a longer thread in deep time depends on what is done with that awareness. The past cannot decide the outcome. It can only demonstrate what happens when its lessons are ignored. In that sense, the deepest lesson of lost civilizations is not about what was forgotten, but about what can still be remembered. If memory is treated not as an accident of survival, but as a responsibility,